Lewis asked me if I would speak for a few minutes, he said 5. I said, well, and he said 10. Well, now that the choir is warming up in there and they don't expect to start singing until 6:30, then I get 15, I think. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Christmas past. In the early days of this valley, there were no homes, no schools, no churches. There were, however, trees, sage and manzanita bushes, wildflowers, and a river that ran deep all year long. This was called the East Valley. San Bernardino was the West Valley. This was the East Valley. And then a family came from New Hampshire via the Santa Fe Trail and arrived at the Assistencia, which is now in Redlands. You think of the Assistencia, but it wasn't Redlands then, it's Redlands now. They brought their lathe with them, loaded on a mule, and they were able to start a furniture factory at the Assistencia. But one day, one of the sons of the family looked across the valley and he fell in love with the beauty of these foothills against the San Bernardino Mountains, and he wondered what they would be like up close. So he hitched his horse up to a wagon and rode across the Santa Ana Wash and eventually built a house in the East Valley. It was 1856, and the house looked like this. It was located on what is now Green Spot Road in that area where the Twin Lakes are, and if you pull into that area where the Twin Lakes are, you will see a monument there with an etching of the old house. But this is what it looked like. It was 17 rooms, which made it big enough for a family with 8 children. There was no plumbing upstairs, but I guess in those days, it was something to have plumbing anywhere. Other houses were soon built, along with a one-room schoolhouse, and a little community formed in the East Valley. It was first called Cramville in honor of the settlers. Then it was called Messina, and finally Highland. What was Christmas like in our valley in those early days? Stories have been told, word of mouth, some have been written down. I'm going to share some of these with you tonight, events that I have recorded as they were told to me, and things that I remember myself. This is the advantage, you see, of getting older. You're part of history, because you remember it yourself, and nobody can say that's wrong, it didn't happen that way, because yes it did, because I was there. Back in the early days, I wasn't back quite that far, but back in the very early days, people celebrated all kinds of holidays, and I don't mean they acknowledged them. They celebrated them. May Day, the 4th of July, the New Year, the Chinese New Year, Easter, Thanksgiving, Valentine's Day, April Fool's Day, the first day of spring, birthdays, weddings, funerals, Bear Flag Day, and the day that each family arrived in California. They had a big celebration for that. All these celebrations have one thing in common. Can you guess what it was? Anybody? Yes. Food. Lots of food. People came in horses and buggies to get where they were going, and they expected to be fed when they got there. Christmas was the biggest celebration of all. Let me tell you what it was like in the house in the picture. These stories were told to me by a very old lady who was my father's cousin, Florence, and she often came to visit her grandparents in this house, and so she remembered the Christmases there. The turkey that was destined for Christmas dinner always had a bath on the day before Christmas because of the dirt in its feathers. The 30-pound Tom was put into a big tub and scrubbed with soap and a brush until it was clean and didn't smell like a barnyard anymore. Then early on Christmas morning, the turkey was stuffed and put into the big wood stove where a fire had been built. The temperature was regulated by feel. My great-grandmother would just put her hand out near the heat and then add a piece of wood as necessary. Many years later, when I was a child, there was a turkey farm in Yucaipa, and the whole family would go to inspect the live gobblers that lived there. My grandmother, after poking a lot of them, she'd go into the turkey yard and poke them. She'd decide which was the puppest, which had the reddest wattle, and which would fit in her roaster pan. So we brought the whole bird home, feathers and all, but no head. I stood on a stool in her kitchen by the sink and helped her pluck the feathers. How many of you have done this with a turkey? Oh, yes. She believed that a child was never too young to learn how to prepare a turkey for the Christmas table. And today, and those of you who have done this, you know what I mean, I can still smell the hot, wet feathers of the bird, scalded. And I can remember reaching out and pinching the little black pin feathers until they popped out. And I just thought that was so much fun. Of course, Christmas could be a time of winter colds and a touch of the rheumatics. A popular chest rub for bronchitis was, and I want you all to be sure and try this year, 4 ounces of camphorated oil, 1½ ounces of turpentine, 1/2 ounce kerosene, and 8 drops of mustard oil. Has anyone here ever experienced the pleasure of a mustard plaster? Ah, you have. Okay, then you know that you feel the heat before it touches your skin, but you will be better in the morning. For aching bones, people ground up 2 lemons with the peel, but without the seeds. They added 2 teaspoons Epsom salts, 2 teaspoons cream of tartar, and a cup of water. 4 tablespoons of this a day would cure you, if you could swallow it. If your feet were tired from Christmas preparations, you soaked them in a mush made of 25 cents worth of bran, mixed with 1 tablespoon of sulfur and a little boiling water. When you were through with that, you put your feet in alum and cold water. Can you imagine what your feet felt like? Food is a more pleasant topic, so let's talk about that. What a variety of food there was at Christmas. The stories say that my great-aunt Nettie made 2 cake batters, 1 pink and 1 white, and then she mixed them together. The finished cake was pink and white, and she made handmade roses to sit on top, handmade sugar roses to sit on top. Great-aunt Lottie was famous for her spoon bread. Have you eaten spoon bread? Yeah. Eaten not only at Christmas, but every time of the year that the family could get her to make the spoon bread. All my children have eaten this spoon bread recipe. It was called Pioneer Comfort Food. Great-aunt Ora's sugared popcorn was a family tradition. And if any of you want the recipe, I'll give it to you. Made with brown sugar syrup that had to be cooked for exactly 16 minutes. My Aunt Ida's grapefruit candy was made for the family and was sold to people in Highland, but only at Christmas. We have never been able to figure out the recipe, even though we have it written down, because she didn't measure anything. She weighed everything on the little scales that were in her kitchen. And of course, fruitcake. The traditional fruitcakes were made a long time before Christmas and wrapped in cloths that were liberally sprinkled with brandy. They called this ripening. Children were given tiny little tastes of the fruitcake for obvious reasons. About 30 people came to dinner in that house and at one table. They put tables and pieces of wood and everything they could think of, put the white cloth cloths on top so that 30 could sit down together, because there were lots of cousins. They ate mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, little pearl onions, tiny little biscuits. My great-grandmother didn't make big biscuits. She said tiny, tiny little biscuits were best. Some of your heads are going up and down. Pumpkin and mince pies, plum pudding, fruitcake. Can you see the cholesterol? Peas that were freshly shelled. Butter rolled with little paddles into pretty shapes. Remember this? They were not put on the table like a cube of butter. Each one was rolled into a pretty little circle shape. And a specialty of the house, pickled muscat grapes. They grew muscat grapes and they pickled them, and they were so popular that they said the children took them to school and traded them in their lunch boxes with other children. I cannot imagine. I have the recipe. Sometimes I'll have the courage to make it someday. On one Christmas, the chickens began acting strangely, walking in circles, falling down. My great-grandfather finally discovered that the Chinese cook, Fong, had mixed wine with the chicken feed because he said it was not good that chickens could not enjoy Christmas with the rest of us. A glowing red pot-bellied stove sat in the library where the children played games and heard stories. But the tree was in the parlor where the fire burned brightly. The men had traveled with horses up steep trails into the mountains to find just the perfect tree. They didn't just go to the shop and pick out a tree. They really worked to get their tree. And they found just the right tree to cut and bring home, and it was tall and fresh, and it smelled good, and it was covered with toys and decorations made from paper lace, pine cones, berry clusters, ribbons, decorated spools, and straight from the oven, gingerbread men with raisin noses and eyes and white icing smiles. There was one tree in Highland that was never decorated. This picture. This picture was taken in 1940 when the tree was over 80 years old. But it was the first tree planted in Highland, first orange tree planted in Highland. And they said they thought of decorating it, but it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can see from the pictures of the figures in it, my grandfather and my sister on the ladder, how big it was. It was planted in 1856. It lived to be over 100 years old, and actually it never died. They finally had to take it out because the county wanted to widen the road. And so the tree went too. But can you imagine how many oranges were produced on that tree? And candles. The trees in the homes were bright with burning candles. We don't have that anymore. My mother wrote her memoirs, and in them she described the trees of the early 1900s, and these are her words. The tree was never decorated until the night before Christmas, and Papa and Mama did it for a surprise for us when we were small. The main attraction was the white wax candles, which were fastened carefully to the tips of the branches, just the tips, to avoid overhanging needles. Papa lighted the candles before he opened the door for us to see the tree, blazing in light. If you have never seen a candle-lit tree, you have missed something beautiful. She went on to say that many Christmas gifts and decorations were homemade. Now today, what would the kids do if they opened the package and found knitted socks? You wouldn't get a whole lot of hoorays, no. But in those days, hand-knitted mittens and socks were treasures because they were cold days, and those were the only things that were going to keep your feet and your hands warm. A new dress or shirt might be made of material purchased from the shelves of the hardware store. Do any of you remember the old-fashioned hardware stores? Yep. Yeah. And how you measured material? You could sit by the pot-bellied stove. There was one in Highland on Palm Avenue with a pot-bellied stove, and try on button-up shoes or admire the colorful ribbon ribbons which hung on spools high on his wall. They were measured by the yard, which was nose to fingertip. So if you had long arms, you could ask the proprietor to let you do the measuring yourself, and then you could get an inch or two more. Some of the toys on the tree were carved because many men in those days spent their time whittling when they weren't working. But these were not normal whittled toys. They were works of art. Wagons with wheels that moved. Horses that looked just like the ones on the ranch and that were painted with the white spots or the black spots to look just like the ranch horses. Little dolls and doll furniture. When my father's cousin Florence was a little girl, she looked under the tree one Christmas morning and found a doll. It had a wax face. And you know what happened when she took it out in the sun to play, because the wax melted. Santa Claus couldn't come down the chimney because of the fire in the fireplace. So he roared up in a wagon with sleigh bells fastened to it, thundered along the east porch of the house, and climbed through a parlor window, saying ho, 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 just as though he had come down the chimney. And they said he always put his head back out the window and told the reindeer to wait for him outside. After the church began in Highland, down on Baseline and Church Streets, and that is where Church Street in Highland got its name, Christmas celebrations were held there as well as in the homes. Now try to imagine the Highland Congregational Church with kerosene lamps. The sanctuary didn't have any pews, but it was well supplied with folding chairs that folded at inopportune moments during the service. The ladies wore skirts that swept the ground, and of course they wear hats and gloves. There were hitching posts out back, but there was no water on the property. For a while, there was only one communion cup, and everybody shared it. And one of my favorite stories is about the debate over whether there would be a Christmas communion one year, because the diaconate got together and met and decided that that communion cup was a health menace for everyone to drink from the same cup because it was cold season and everybody had colds. The Christmas tree in our old church on Palm in Maine reached the ceiling of the sanctuary, and young and old gathered to decorate it. Almost everybody in the church was there on decoration night, just to put up a decoration, just to put up one bottle. In the days before World War II, we were always told to be really careful about handling angel hair. You don't see that anymore. It's very hard. You can buy it online, but it's not safe. It's also called spun glass. And although it refracts the light and looks really beautiful, it can cut your fingers. And so the children weren't allowed to touch it, but we were allowed to touch the Lux Flakes snow, which my grandmother made by beating Lux Flakes and water with an egg beater in a big bowl, and when it was just right, she would take the spatula and spread it, and it looked just like snow on the branches of the tree, so the children could do that. All the children had to memorize what were called pieces, and they had to recite them. Little poems with Christmas messages. Now, the little children only had a few lines to memorize, but the bigger children had to recite several stanzas, complete with gestures with the arms in the air and bowing and scraping, just as in an elocution class. The Christmas story was always portrayed, and I will never forget the year that I was the angel that brought the message and I wore a bed sheet for my costume. These were Depression days, and we made do with what we had. And I'll never forget the Christmas when Mr. Ed Tepler, Mr. Arthur Franklin, and Mr. Fred Auerbacher, staunch choir members, and staunch church members, and staunch members of the community, well-known men, came down the aisle of the church in their winter bathrobes with paper cardboard crowns on their head, enthusiastically singing "We Three Kings of Orient Are." We had no money for fancy costumes, but we had enthusiasm and plenty of it. There was joy and fellowship Lots of laughter when little Georgie Hellier, who grew up to become a well-respected attorney, got his tongue caught in his Santa Claus mask and couldn't get it out to recite his poem. The Sunday school superintendent had to stop the program while somebody climbed up on the stage and pried him loose. We thought the music from the choir was the most beautiful in the world. Our tree was the grandest ever. Our Christmas was the most joyful ever. The church members were one big family, just like you are here tonight. We shared our joys and triumphs, just like we do in church every Sunday morning. Our sorrows, our losses. We were a small church, but we felt very large. And when it was time for Santa to arrive with great bursts of ho, 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 and those of you who remember, Winfield Bailey was Santa Claus for 30 or 40 years. A lot of you still remember him. And when he came in and said, "Merry Christmas," the children could hardly contain their excitement, for there were gifts under the tree. And there were always extra gifts so that no child who was visiting would be left out. Every Christmas has been a Christmas to remember. Let's put this one in our memory books to cherish. And above all, let's remember the gift of love that isn't under the tree. The gift of love that's in our hearts.